German Chancellor Olaf Scholz visits Beijing. What's ahead for the China-Germany relationship? Hello, I'm Nathan King, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. Hello again. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was in Beijing Friday for an official visit, and he met with Chinese President Xi Jinping at the Great Hall of the People. Scholz's visit to China was the first by a Western leader since the start of COVID-19 pandemic. He was accompanied by a sizable business delegation. Both countries have strong economic ties, and China has been Germany's top trading partner for 6 consecutive years. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang stressed the importance of the relationship.
China-Germany relations continue to develop healthily and steadily. We believe that it is a signal sent to the world that we jointly uphold multilateralism and support multipolarity.
To discuss all of this, joining me from Beijing is Victor Gao, who needs no introduction, but here it is. He's the chair of professor at Soochow University. Also joining the discussion is German political commentator Klaus Larres. He is a professor of history, international relations at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. With us also is from Tel Aviv is Gong. What are you doing in Tel Aviv, John? We'll have to talk about that. He's a professor of economics at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. And from Brussels, we are also joined by European Union political analyst Peter Kleppe. He is the editor-in-chief of the Brussels Report. Thank you so much for all of us, you for joining the show. We've got a really nice China-Europe balance on the panel today. Let's start in China. Victor, this visit is the first by Olaf Scholz as Chancellor, the first since the 20th Party Congress, and as we said in our open, the first Western leader to visit since COVID-19 pandemic. Aside from all those historics, there's a lot of business to be done, right?
Absolutely. I think Chancellor Scholz was very warmly welcomed in Beijing today, even though his visit was very short. He did not stay overnight in Beijing. And he went like a whirlwind. However, his visit is very significant for China-German relations. And I think business communities in both China and in Germany really cheered about his long overdue visit. And I think it also ushered in a new era between China and Germany in their bilateral relations, because both countries wanted to see that they really move forward with their very steady, very mutually beneficial, very close relations with each other, despite of whatever headwind there is in between the two countries and in the world.
Well, I'm glad you said new era, because that phrase has been bandied about a lot. Let's listen to the man himself, because he brings a message that isn't necessarily the European Union's message, definitely not the American message, which is a warning about the decoupling language that we've seen over the last few years. Let's take a listen.
What is clear to us is that we do not believe in ideas of decoupling. But it is also clear to us that this has something to do with economic ties as equals, with reciprocity, with the issue that access to investment must be provided equally, and that no dependencies arise that contribute to the fact that one cannot act freely. That is at least the perspective that we are pursuing.
Peter Kleppe, I want to bring you in here. What was the message from Olaf Scholz in Beijing, and also the message back in Germany? Because let's face it, this trip was not without controversy within his government too.
Absolutely, there was a lot of controversy, more than otherwise. I mean, the foreign minister of Germany, Annalena Baerbock from the Green Party, she did not join Scholz on this trip. And she was unhappy with it. She, along with many others, has been making the case that after having become too dependent on Russia, it is not a good idea to become overly dependent on China. And look, to be fair to Scholz, he has listened to this. He has indeed made some noises in that direction, which was also mentioned in the earlier report. He has also deliberately mentioned human rights and the situation in Xinjiang province in order to prove that he's not only there for a business trip, which was indeed what people have been accusing him of. Also at the European level, many were not pleased, especially in France. French President Macron has been proposing to go to China on a joint trip. Scholz has not done that. Apparently, he still thinks that he should continue the policies of his predecessor, Ms. Merkel, which always went to China on her own,
Right.
and at the time was seen as even a representative of Europe.
Yeah, I mean, he made clear, which I thought was interesting. There's a Politico Europe article in which he penned where he said he's going for Germany, but also representing European values. And I just find it strange that even the French thought they would go along. I mean, I don't think it has happened before. But let me bring in Klaus Larres as well, because I just want to follow up on what Peter said and flesh it out a little bit. I was reading in the Financial Times the other day quotes from some of German businesses that are going. BASF, for example, said, "I think it's urgently necessary to stop the China bashing, look out for ourselves a bit more, look at ourselves a bit more self-critically." They're talking about essentially China being a source for many raw materials, the biggest market. It's not just them. Aldi plan to open hundreds of stores, etc. going forward. This is a real stark difference from the language that I hear every day here out of Washington and the increasing tightening in terms of trade relations and the political outlook. Germany seems to be really continuing to chart a course of its own here, in spite of Washington and in spite of Emmanuel Macron and other people in Europe.
Well, it was Scholz's inaugural visit. It would have been unusual to take another European leader along on your inaugural visit. Macron wouldn't have done that either. And Scholz has to play a very careful balancing act. He doesn't want to decouple from China, as he has made repeatedly clear, but he also does not want to continue the old policy of Angela Merkel. He realizes that there's a new tension in the relationship, there's new conflicts, and there's new caution which has to be applied. On the other hand, not to talk and to avoid each other and to isolate each other doesn't lead to anything either. So he's really trying to play a balancing act. He does not want to antagonize the United States nor his European colleagues. And he has said he also comes to China as a European, not just as a German leader. But he also wants to continue the relatively good relationship with China, which has developed over the last 10 to 20 years, not least because of Angela Merkel. But he has mentioned a number of topics which are controversial, such as the Taiwan issue, such as human rights, such as the non-sufficiency of reciprocity in economic relations. But he has urged Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang to do something about Russia, to put pressure on Russia not to resort to nuclear weapons, obviously, but also to make sure that perhaps peace negotiations can be entered into with Ukraine and that the war can come to an end eventually. And all that is, of course, not easy. It's controversial, but he has tried to play that middle ground and essentially has asked Xi Jinping to act as a mediator between Russia and Ukraine.
Klaus,
I don't think
Klaus, I just want to follow up on that point, because you make an excellent point here, which is essentially both Xi Jinping and Olaf Scholz sort of repeated the declaration they made a few months ago back at the United Nations, both their respective countries, that the use of nuclear weapons in the Ukraine conflict would be essentially a red line. Which is a repetition, but welcomed. And both countries seem to have a much more realistic view of the conflict, albeit coming from different perspectives, than some of their allies and neighbours. Is that fair to say that Germany and China here seem to have some common ground about a sort of more realistic approach to ending the war?
Well, I think all nations in the world agree that the use of nuclear weapons would be totally impossible. But the Germans in particular are, of course, particularly frightened of war. They're particularly frightened of the nuclear threat, not least because geographically much closer to Russia and Ukraine than other countries, including, of course, China and the United States. And they are really frightened about the global order, about supply line continuities. They are really very frightened that the war will continue forever and that it will lead to even further disruptions in all sorts of ways, both human rights ways and, of course, energy and economic ways. So asking Xi Jinping to perhaps get more involved, and Xi Jinping, as we know, has not undermined Russia's position. He has not condemned Russia's position. So he is perhaps the person who has a great deal of influence on Putin. And Scholz asked him really to use that influence and to push Putin into a much more constructive position regarding ending the Ukraine war and not using nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I'm not going to be flippant here, but asking an Asian country to intervene in a European conflict would perhaps be a first. John Gong, I'm going to go to you. What are your takeaways from your perspective in Tel Aviv today? I hope you're enjoying Israel. You know, these are two countries that have essentially forged a tremendous economic relationship over the past 20, 30 years. Where do you see it going?
Well, I see it going further. The relationship, economic relations keep developing. Other than that, I don't see another choice. You know, we have to keep in mind that China and Germany have a huge commercial interest by maintaining this relationship. It's a almost $250 billion bilateral trade relationship, not to mention the slew of German companies that have been operating successfully here in China. BMW, the Mercedes-Benz, Audi, for example. These three luxurious auto brands dominate the automobile landscape, the luxurious portion of the automobile landscape here in China. And yeah, they're huge companies. And there are other good examples of that. So I think you know, Germany's economic interest in China is huge. Now I do want to address this issue about too much dependence on China in the context of the comparison with Russia. And I think these are totally different stories. First of all, Germany is relying on Russia almost in a unilateral way. It buys a very critical commodity from Russia. Now, the relationship between China and Germany is totally different. It's mutually dependent. We buy a lot of things from Germany. Germany also buys a lot of things from China. So, you know, in this kind of a relationship, there's no way to say it. It's a one-way dependence relationship. Story here. It's totally different. Second, I think, you know, the political context is totally different. You know, Russia is engaged in a war in Ukraine, in a sense, has moved its troops into Ukraine. China has never done that for the better part of the last, 3 decades. So, the whole idea of this comparison, this analogy of Beijing with Russia, with Moscow,
the Western headlines we've seen,
it's totally inappropriate.
Yeah, you're right. The Western headlines, Taiwan could be the new Ukraine. It is very sort of knee-jerk and facile in lots of ways. But, it has captured some of the European attention, and hence the criticism of this trip. Victor Gao, I just want to pick up on what John Gong just said about interdependence rather than reliance. There's a lot of examination, especially, this is not just political, it's COVID too. Supply chains were choked off in various industries. Automotive, of course, is a huge industry in Germany. How does China and Germany rebalance that relationship while also taking into account the new political realities as well?
Well, first of all, we are in a new landscape in terms of global geopolitical situation. That's for sure. However, allow me to emphasize several things. One is that truly between China and Germany, there should be no fundamental differences between these two countries. And they are not enemies or adversaries to each other by any stretch of the imagination. And, for example, China believes it is a major force promoting peace and stability in the world. And Germany is also a major force in Europe, which should really promote peace. All of us should join hands in working out a solution so that the war in Ukraine should end, because the longer it protracts, the more destructive it will be, not only for European countries, but for many countries beyond Europe. In that sense, countries like China and Germany really need to consider working closer with each other, rather than, for example, having a wedge thrown into their bilateral relations by anyone in the world. And I also believe that if anyone believes that they can impose their version of the world onto Germany in complete disregard of the realities between China and Germany in terms of their bilateral relations, especially economic and trade relations, that's probably a little bit of a fantasy in itself. Allow me also to emphasize, in China, there is good, strong goodwill towards Germany in terms of general admiration of the quality, assurance, for example, certainty of the German products, for example, the German services, as well as the high level of attention attached to details in the products made in Germany. This is why in China there is a lot of consumer confidence in made in Germany products. And I hope Germany should really appreciate that the China market, with such a strong goodwill towards German products, towards German people in general, is really a very valuable thing. We need to avoid doing anything which can bring a damage to such long-standing goodwill among the Chinese people, for the German people at large, as well as for the German products and services in particular.
Point taken, Victor. Peter, though, Germany is not Europe, although probably the dominant economic, if not the most political power. There has been criticism within Germany recently of COSCO, the Chinese shipping company, taking a stake in one of the port operators in Hamburg, not taking over the whole port, as been suggested in some of the headlines, and reducing the ability of the shareholding. I think it's now 24.9%. And also there have been differences, as we saw from Paris and Berlin's discussions about an approach to China. And Germany, sorry, I'm getting to the end of this question, but I just want to answer all of it. And Germany itself is reworking its China strategy in light of the coalition of the new government. Where do you see this going forward?
Well, the whole challenge will be to try to find a balancing act. I think the consensus in Germany is that there are deep, profound economic problems, and perhaps interrupting trade drastically with the most important trade partner, China, is not a good idea right now. So for better or for worse, that's the consensus in the government in Berlin. What people overlook, though, is that Germany's dependence on Russia, or let's say the excessive dependence on Russia, this was not some kind of a natural outcome of a market process. It was because of the Germany's policies, supposedly to benefit the environment, to reduce fossil fuel production and nuclear power production in Germany. This led to Germany having to import more fossil fuels from other countries, primarily Russia, than it would otherwise have done. And interestingly, the German and European Union plan to ban the traditional combustion engine may also create an artificial dependence on China, given how important China is for the production of...
But you are making a distinction here, and I think it's a subtle one, but it's worth elevating, is that the over-dependence on Russian raw material, i.e. oil, and the market-driven energies of tomorrow, which is yet to be fleshed out. So I see what you're saying, but they're not exactly the same, right?
Well, I'm mostly saying that the dependence on Russia was partly artificial, and the plan to ban traditional combustion engines is also likely to make Germany more dependent on China than it would otherwise become. But yet almost nobody is talking about that. They're talking about interrupting trade instead of basically letting the markets, freely provide for a more balanced trade relationship.
Klaus, this is a very interesting point, isn't it? Because as Germany does emerge from its so-called dependence on Russian oil and gas. It's fired up coal plants again. There is a big ambitious target. We've got another COP meeting coming up in Egypt about reducing greenhouse gases going forward. And yet China does have a jump on US and others when it comes to the market for the technologies of tomorrow, for the green revolution. So how does Europe balance that, considering also the pressure that they're getting from Washington to consume American natural gas and also join in the sort of, let's face it, pretty much trade embargo when it comes to high-end semiconductors, etc. It must be a very difficult position for Germany, Europe of course, but Germany too as the dominant economy in Europe.
Well, the EU is, of course, an independent player in world affairs, and it wants to be a global player, and particularly regarding climate change issues and technology, which defeats climate change. And that also applies to some extent to Germany, embedded within the European Union. But we do have to see that there is room for improvement in Chinese-German relations in the economic sphere, for example. You know, reciprocity of market access needs to still be improved. We recently had that crisis about the COSCO's participation in the harbor terminal in Hamburg, and that has now been largely resolved, I believe. But something like that would not be possible for a German company in China. So access to a Chinese port, even at a minute level, is not possible for German companies, but the Chinese companies got that right. And I think that needs to be looked at and needs to be improved. Reciprocity should be taken seriously for both sides, obviously. Also regarding what Victor Gao quite rightly said, of course, both China and Germany are very interested in peace and a peaceful world, clearly. But there is room for improvement. What China could do regarding Russia, put more pressure on Russia to do something about coming to an end of the Ukraine war, perhaps withdrawing its forces from Ukraine, because it was Russia who invaded Ukraine. Also, you know, pressure regarding nuclear weapons, that Putin shouldn't keep talking about the use of nuclear weapons. I think here China really has a lot of possibility to, perhaps behind the scenes, you know, not necessarily in public, but to put pressure on Putin and tell him there are certain red lines which he cannot really go beyond.
Very good points there, and of course the reiteration of against any nuclear use in the Ukraine conflict was actually welcome from both leaders. John, just pick up on this whole idea of the energy of the future and how Germany and China can cooperate, because essentially we are in a massive transition here. And, you know, while the conflict in Ukraine has led to the firing up of coal plants around the world because of higher energy prices as well, there is a move towards renewables. How does the China-Germany relationship shape the future? Because obviously the US is very much involved as well. Can you see a conflict here or more cooperation?
No, I don't see a conflict here. But first, let me address this issue. I want to add a comment on, you know, this deal in Hamburg.
Sure.
My understanding is that it is the COSCO's German partners who actually first proposed this deal. So it's actually coming from the German side to ask COSCO to take a share ownership of this one part of this harbor facility.
And they've done it before in other areas of Europe.
The reason behind this, exactly, the reason is because it wants to solidify the relationship, you know, to make sure that the shipments into Central and Eastern European areas would be, you know, big portion of it still going through this Hamburg port. So this is actually out of entirely out of a commercial interest. Now, in terms of the issue about reciprocity for German companies acquiring infrastructures in China, I think it has to be a case-on-case basis. There's no general rule that China is totally refusing German interests. If you talk about, you know, telecom, of course it's off the limit. If you're talking about, you know, port facility, I'm not sure it's an absolute answer of no. If German company wants to buy a stretch of highway in China, absolutely, it shouldn't be a problem in my view. So I think, you know, the issue is about reciprocity is mostly about commercial interests, and it needs to be discussed on a case-by-case basis.
Well, I remember last time
your question about the energy issue.
John, I just want to follow up. Sorry to interrupt you. There was the European bilateral investment treaty pushed through in the last few years, and there have been some positive signs from European countries about opening up. We've heard from just after the 20th Party Congress words saying, look, we want to continue opening up. What do you think? I know you've been a trade lawyer and worked on various sides in various advice. What advice would you give to German companies who want to maybe take a stake in something like a port in China, like Costco have done at a facility in Hamburg?
Well, I think the bilateral investment treaty issue is mostly it's stranded right now, mostly because of the European Parliament. I think the German companies and German politicians would like to have this deal to happen, but it's right now it's sort of hanging up in the European continent Parliament, from other politicians that are they have been issues with the Chinese government, and that's the stumbling block. Now, in terms of the question about Germans' interest in acquiring some infrastructures in China, I think go ahead, talk to the Chinese government, talk to the relevant business partner to see if it's possible. Again, I want to say that there is no such thing about it's a generic answer that no answer here. I don't think that's the case. It's all based on commercial interest. It's all based on a case-by-case basis. And I'm not even sure that there's a company in Germany that's interested in buying a piece of a port facility here in China. Okay. If they want to do that, everything's for sale at a price, I guess.
Okay, I'm going to end with a fun question. What's the most favorite German product in China, Victor?
Automobile.
Mercedes?
And machinery. All kinds of very high machineries. Mercedes, Audi, you name it. And BMW, I drive a BMW and I have a Mercedes. And Volkswagen is very popular in China among the general population.
Okay, Klaus, what's your favorite Chinese product in Germany?
Well, that's difficult to answer right now. Maybe Chinese tea.
Always good. A cup of green tea always refreshes me, especially before one of these fantastic discussions. I want to thank everyone from China to Brussels and beyond. Really intelligent discussion, and without the usual rhetoric that we sometimes see when it comes to these international events. That's it for this edition of The Heat. Thanks again for watching, and have a great weekend.